Okay, good afternoon and perhaps good morning to some people joining this next session. Thank you for coming along and thank you for joining. Um, Welcome everyone to this session of Make Climate Action Everyone's Business Forum, hosted by the International Chamber of Commerce over the past 2 weeks. My name is Mars McCarthy. I'm Director at the Carbon Trust, based here in London, but we are a global organisation. And we have an hour today with you to talk through, as the title says, making business sense of Scope 3 emissions. We will explain what Scope 3 emissions are and talk through how organisations measure and take action off the back of those. Joining me today is one of my colleagues, Samuel Bird, who will present some of the slides shortly. Myself, Sam and I both work in our consulting part of Carbon Trust, working with global businesses. And we will be joined by Simon Boas Hofmeyr, who is Director of Sustainability at Carlsberg Group. Carlsberg are one of our global clients. We've worked with Carlsberg since back in 2016, working with them across their whole value chain, but in a big focus on their Scope 3 emissions. So Simon will be able to bring to life and demonstrate some real practicalities of how Scope 3 accounting and value chain accounting is achieved and how that can help to drive the setting of an ambition as well as delivering reductions across the whole value chain of a business such as Carlsberg's. We're going to try and split the session, the hour we have, up into 3 parts. The plan is that Carbon Trust will present for around 20 minutes. We'll then move over to Simon to present for 20 minutes or so. And we then therefore hope to have 20 minutes at the end for questions and discussion. Please do see on the right of your screen the comments page. Please, as we go through, do put comments down, questions, anything that's unclear. I will be keeping an eye on that, coordinate that, and we'll open up some discussion later on. But please don't hold back. If you've got any questions or if you just want things to be discussed, please put them down there. We'll have plenty of time to do that at the end of the session. Next slide, please. Just a very brief introduction of Carbon Trust. We are a trusted expert in net zero carbon reduction and sustainability. We are an organization that's been in existence for about 20 years now, supporting businesses, governments, and other organizations around the world. Our size, we're just over 300 people now, working across around about half a dozen offices globally. Our early work was focused in the UK, funded by UK government to support UK business and public sector and cities. But now we work with technology innovation, corporates, cities, governments on policy, and local authorities globally to help them to develop, to measure and develop roadmaps to reduce their impacts. So that's Carbon Trust. Nice to meet you all, and hopefully we can have some discussion afterwards. Next slide, please. So very briefly, just to look at what we're trying to achieve today, we'd like just to talk through the approach to measuring Scope 3 and to measure value chain emissions. So going beyond an organization's own activities to look at the impacts upstream in their supply chain and downstream in how their products and services are used and disposed of. So the whole value chain emissions. Understand how that approach can then lead to the setting of credible reduction targets, as well as development of appropriate roadmaps to reduce and to achieve those targets, and to develop actions to tackle the emissions along the value chain. And as I mentioned earlier, our client Simon from Carlsberg will be able to put some real world experience and case study from his business on how value chain accounting is both value chain measurement and target setting is achieved, and what impact that has had on Carlsberg's business. That's, I think, all I had to present. I'm going to hand over now to my colleague Sam, who will talk through our sector of the presentation. Thank you, Sam.
Great, thank you very much, Miles, and hello everyone on the call today. It's great to be here. So, first of all, I just wanted to touch on what do we actually mean when we refer to Scope 3 or value chain emissions. And I'm sure many of you on the call are familiar with this terminology and probably will have seen the image on the screen before as well. It's from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, who developed the standard for emissions reporting. But for those who may not be as familiar with the terminology, the key points to note here are greenhouse gas sources of emissions are separated into scopes by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol for reporting purposes. Firstly, we have scopes 1 and 2, and these refer to emissions relating to a company's own operations, for example, fuel combustion at a company's factory or office locations. And then Scope 3 effectively covers everything else in a company's wider value chain. Under the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, Scope 3 emissions are separated into 15 categories, and these are grouped into upstream emissions and downstream emissions, as Miles just mentioned. With the upstream, these would typically relate to supply chain activities, and then downstream could relate to products that a company sells, or perhaps other activities that the company undertakes, such as investment activities. And when we refer to the term value chain emissions, this essentially encompasses all scopes defined by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. So that's not only your Scope 3 emissions, but also those organizational related emissions under Scopes 1 and 2. Then when we look at value chain emissions for different industries, we see that Scope 3 can make up a significant portion. Where within Scope 3 these emissions are situated, however, can vary considerably by sector. So as we see on this slide here, for example, in the dairy industry, Scope 3 emissions are very much in the upstream due to carbon-intensive activities of raising cattle and all other farming-associated activities. Whereas perhaps if you're a company that sells home appliance pieces of equipment, Scope 3 may actually be focused on the downstream area of the value chain. So where these appliances will have energy requirements to operate them, these will also have associated carbon emissions that need to be accounted for. The fact that Scope 3 emissions are likely to be a significant element of an organization's total emissions means that they'll be a key factor in the overall sustainability strategy of a company. And by measuring or performing a screening exercise to understand your Scope 3 emissions, it helps to identify the crucial areas where strategy efforts should be focused. Aside from the sheer size that Scope 3 emissions could make up for an organization, externally, there are many requirements for companies to consider Scope 3 as well. So one hot topic area that we have on the left here is TCFD, or the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. The task force has been set up with the aim to develop more efficient and effective climate-related disclosures that will promote more informed investment, credit, and insurance underwriting decisions. These recommendations provided by the TCFD can apply to any company in the world, and disclosures should form part of a company's mainstream financial filings, giving clear information about a company's approach to dealing with climate-related risks and opportunities. Now, the relevance of Scope 3 here is that if you have a substantial Scope 3 footprint, the drivers of carbon may equally be drivers for risk and opportunity. So if your supply chain is very carbon intensive, for example, this could lead you to be vulnerable to climate risks, such as carbon regulations imposed on your suppliers, which may result in increased costs being passed down to you. Or equally, opportunities such as energy efficiency in the supply chain may actually help reduce costs that you incur. If we look at the downstream, emissions, so these will relate to generally what a company is selling. If you sell a product which is very energy consuming intensive, there could be the risk that you become less competitive if a rival creates a more energy efficient alternative. On the other hand, an opportunity again may present itself where product innovation could actually improve your situation in the market and your competitiveness if you're able to provide a product which is more energy efficient. Secondly, we have the Science-Based Targets Initiative on the right. A lot of businesses are setting science-based targets to reduce their emissions, and are having these targets validated by the Science Based Targets initiative. The number of companies signing up has been growing considerably over the last couple of years, and the SBTi has seen a rapid increase in the lead up to this COP. In the last couple of weeks, the SBTi released a corporate net zero standard, and the standard is the first of its kind and will guide companies in setting science-aligned net zero targets, which can also be validated by the SBTi as of January next year. Now, in terms of the relevance for Scope 3 here, if a company wishes to set a net zero target and have this validated by the SBTi, this target will need to cover Scope 3 emissions as well as Scopes 1 and 2. Therefore, measurement of Scope 3 must be performed to understand what the reduction requirements might be. In addition to these longer-term net zero targets that companies may be looking to set, if a company wishes to set a near-term science-based target, and again have this validated by the Science Based Targets initiative, there will also be still a requirement to consider Scope 3. A company is required under the SBTi to perform at least a screening exercise of Scope 3, and the SBTi states that if a company's Scope 3 emissions make up more than 40% of the total value chain emissions, then an ambitious Scope 3 target must be set that covers at least 2/3 of the Scope 3 footprint. From July 2022, any absolute reduction Scope 3 target that's set by a company will need to be aligned to limit global warming to either a well below 2 degrees pathway or a 1.5 degree pathway. And this is seeing a rise in ambition where previously companies could set a Scope 3 target but was aligned to a 2 degree pathway. The key point here again is that having a well-defined and measured Scope 3 footprint will help companies to track these targets and also identify categories which may be included in that 2/3 target boundary, identifying those key hotspot areas, for instance. So now we've looked at the relevance of why measuring Scope 3 is important. How does a company tackle these Scope 3 emissions? When it comes to approaching and assessing Scope 3 emissions, it generally follows the same principles of carbon management. Firstly, you measure your carbon footprint. You then identify where reductions in emissions can be undertaken, and you set targets. You then go through the process of implementing energy efficiency initiatives and tracking these reductions over time. And finally, you may look to report data and progress to external stakeholders. So that is the general carbon management process for a company's own operations. And then when we incorporate Scope 3, it certainly adds scale and complexity to this, as can be seen from the text around these 4 processes. With measurement, there may be significantly more data to collect, and often this data may come from individual stakeholders that the company may not have had to engage with previously, and these also could be external to the business. When it comes to setting targets, there may be limited understanding of the reduction opportunities associated to these emissions. And then when it comes to the implementation, some of the sources of Scope 3 emissions may be something that a company has limited influence over and can make it difficult to undertake reduction. Finally, with reporting, a company may have uncertainty with the overall numbers relating to Scope 3 emissions, and therefore they may question whether they're ready to report, and perhaps how do they track reductions over time. These are all aspects that come into play when managing Scope 3 emissions, and is exactly why it can seem like a daunting task. But making a start is the biggest hurdle, and it really is encouraged that companies begin to take on the challenge of their Scope 3 footprint. Firstly, to obtain greater understanding of the impact. From the data that is collected during this process, this can then help to feed into the overall process to tackle some of these additional challenges that come with Scope 3 management. So firstly, when we're looking at the measurement exercise of Scope 3, as the previous slide showed, the data required to measure your Scope 3 footprint can be considerable, and yet the availability of this data can also be limited. As a result, there are various calculation approaches to put together a scope-free footprint and understand where those sources of emissions are coming from. To determine which approaches are suitable for a company, it's important to consider what the business objectives are for measuring scope-free. For example, if you're looking to drive change in your supply chain, you may want greater detail data relating to your upstream emissions. Or perhaps you may just be undertaking an exercise to meet stakeholder expectations or reporting requirements, and having an overall hotspot analysis of your footprint may be sufficient to meet these requirements. The other aspect to consider is where the material categories of emissions are likely to be in your value chain. Understanding where these are will drive where the data collection efforts should be focused. So it's all about taking a pragmatic approach and prioritizing the key areas of your value chain. Once business objectives and material categories of emissions have been assessed, calculation approaches can then be assigned to different categories. And here we have two examples on the screen. On the left, we have a calculation approach which is typically using life cycle assessment data. An approach here would be to obtain activity-based or quantity-based data, such as quantities of a particular product purchased, and to apply appropriate emission factors to this data. The factors here are much more specific, with a lower level of uncertainty, and these can often be taken from prior product footprinting work if a company has undertaken this. The downside here is that the data collection efforts can be much more resource intensive, and therefore it can be very time consuming to collect this information. As an alternative, on the right here, we have spend-based emission factors, typically known as environmentally extended input-output factors, or EEIO factors. These factors are far more general and will generally use a company's procurement spend data, which will then be multiplied by a carbon factor. Typically, these emission factors are at a global level and lack the detail that the life cycle assessment approach would have. And therefore, the emission factors may not be as specific to a company's operations. However, the advantage here is that they could be a quick, easy option to determine a kind of viewpoint as to what a company's scope-free footprint may look like, and may not incur the resource requirements of using LCA data. Following this process, the steps would be to collect the required data and then calculate the emissions using the determined approaches that a company may wish to undertake based on their business objectives. And now, once this pragmatic approach has been undertaken for the first time round and a scope-free footprint has been calculated, ways to improve data quality of a scope-free footprint over time can then be looked at. It's important to note that due to the scale and complexity, it's not always expected to get everything perfect the first time round when measuring scope-free. Therefore, a notion of continual improvement will be a key aspect for measuring your scope-free footprint. And as this graphic shows on the screen, as you identify areas of reduction once measuring your footprint for the first time, perhaps you see opportunities in your supply chain, for example, you may engage with your suppliers to understand where reductions can be made, and you may also collect more primary data from these suppliers, which may be a better quality nature from the data that had previously been used. This, over time, will therefore improve accuracy and certainty of the footprint, and your methodologies for calculating the footprint may also change. As a result, it's important to note that rebaselining a scope-free footprint may be required, and this is a very common kind of process and something which is expected as data improvements occur. Once measured, the subsequent areas of scope-free carbon management can then be undertaken. As we've spoken about before, there will be a process perhaps of setting reduction targets, and these may include having targets externally validated by the Science Based Targets initiative. There also may be the opportunity for companies to then also set internal targets, looking at where further reductions can be undertaken. During the implementation stage, in terms of what reduction implementation initiatives can be undertaken, at the core for Scope 3, there are things that you can do relating to acting on your supply chain or suppliers, and also acting on your product initiatives. And these will then largely fall into efficiency or performance initiatives, as well as transformation initiatives. As an overview, areas of action to reduce emissions generally comprise of the initiatives shown on the outer circle of the diagram shown in the middle on this slide. There are likely to be others, but depending on which industry you operate in, but these are some of the key levers. So in terms of efficiencies, these could be supplier development, working with your suppliers, collaborating to understand how improvements in the supply chain can be undertaken, or perhaps setting energy efficiency programs with suppliers. And then with transformation, this very much is looking at business model innovation, where perhaps procurement approaches may change to perhaps sourcing more recycled materials. There could be also ways to innovate and create new products, which could be less carbon intensive. And then finally, there's that process of reporting. Once you have your scope 3 data and you're able to report this externally, it helps to build confidence. As can be seen with some of the organizations on the right here, there are expectations of stakeholders, expecting that scope 3 emissions are reported on. So this can be the case with certain disclosure schemes such as CDP or the Carbon Disclosure Project. And we've also discussed some of the expectations of TCFD in reporting on climate risk and opportunity. With reporting, it's important to accept that data will not always be perfect the first time round, and this then goes back to that process of continual improvement. There's likely to be changes reported year on year, and ultimately it's key just to communicate these changes and to explain where perhaps improvements may have been made. Ultimately, the key is to have scope 3 data that is good enough to identify priority areas and help you implement the right decisions to reducing emissions for your business and being able to report on these. So hopefully this gives you a good summary of how measuring scope 3 can support a company's sustainability mission. Scope 3 can comprise of a significant portion of a company's overall emissions and needs to be considered. As this slide shows, having an understanding of scope 3 and overall value chain emissions is not an isolated sustainability issue, but instead having that measurement and understanding can support a business in many ways that can help drive better strategic decisions. It can support with decisions around product design and also improving supply chain strategy lines, as we've briefly touched on. And it can also help with strategic decisions when determining which direction of growth a company may wish to go in, also analysing areas of risk. So overall, scope 3, hand in hand with overall business strategy, can really help drive a company's future direction. So I hope these slides have been useful in providing an overview to scope 3. And now I'd like to pass over to Simon, if he's on the line, to take us through the insights that Carlsberg have with their sustainability strategy and measuring scope 3. So over to you, Simon.
Thank you, Sam. And we'll just take 20 minutes from Simon now to give some real life example of the processes we've just described, but also the areas of impact and opportunity for change in an organization such as Carlsberg. Please do keep tapping away any questions or areas of clarification you would like us to make. We will have 20 minutes at the end to have a discussion and to answer your questions. So please don't hold back. Thank you so far to the contributors, and I'm collecting those up and we'll have those conversations in 20 minutes or so. Over to you, Simon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sam and Miles. And just to clarify, can you hear me right now? Because that's a pretty important start of a presentation.
Yeah, you're coming through loud and clear. We can see your bottle of beer behind you.
Exactly. So I think it's actually important that that's where we start, with the bottle of beer behind me. Because back in 2016, we were on a journey to create a new corporate strategy. And that corporate strategy, of course, included sustainability. One of the areas that we saw as being the most material or most important to us and to the world was to achieve the ambition that you have to the far left on this slide, which is zero carbon footprint. And that came out of the work that we have been doing on assessing where are the major issues for society and where are the major impacts on the business. And altogether, this comprised our strategy Together Towards Zero, which we launched in 2017. However, before we were able to launch that ambition, with very concrete targets underneath, there was a lot of work that we needed to do. And we did that, among others, together with Carbon Trust, who was our prime partner on carbon emissions and specifically on the value chain footprint that we have. But before I go into the nitty-gritty details of how we actually got there, I would like to see the next slide where you can see where we actually ended up. Because after the process that I'm going to show you, in fact, we ended up with quite ambitious targets. So this was in June 17 that we announced these targets. And basically they are cut into two different timelines. Number one is 2030. So this is quite a big year for sustainability in general. It's the year where we have the SDGs with their kind of target date. It's the year where we will see whether we're on track towards the Paris Agreement or not. So 2030 was for us the right year to have targets towards. And when you look at our targets underneath, you will see that we have an aim to have 0 carbon emissions from our breweries. So for the geeks out there that might be on the line, these are our scope 1 and 2 emissions, excluding own logistics. So basically we're saying we want to fully decarbonize that part. The other part is really what we are talking about today. So this is what we call the beer in hand emissions, or scope 3. And if you want to know much more about the details in our scope 3 reporting, I would encourage you to go and read our sustainability report. It's on our website. In there, you can see all of the different 15 categories, how we are stacking up against it, and how much of our total value chain footprint that is included in that target. However, it was important for us to not only have a target towards 2030, but also one towards 2022. And that is basically because our top management was of the belief that it was simply not enough to have a long-term target. You needed to measure yourself against the short term as well. And that is why we said we want to achieve half already by 2022. And actually this premise of having short-term milestones is actually one of the prerequisites of having a science-based target. Next slide, please. And in fact, when we did our analysis together with Carbon Trust, we set up 3 different work streams. And the first one was really pointing back to what Sam just showed you. And that was in terms of setting targets, you had to really understand your operational and value chain carbon footprint. So this was really the first work stream. Number 2 was then to calculate these science-based targets according to your footprint. Of course, you first need to understand your baseline. And number 3 was then really to put in a really structured, robust plan for how to achieve those emissions reductions. And actually, we were one of I believe, first 150 companies in the world to set science-based targets and have them approved. And in fact, when we look at our specific science-based targets, we were aligned with the 1.5 degree scenario already in 2017. And of course, that is something that has meant that our targets were somewhat future-proofed according to the new criteria that has now come out of the SBTi. And of course, that's something we're very proud of. And it also shows us that the level of ambition that we set in 2017 was absolutely the right one for us, but also for the planet's trajectory. Next slide. When you look at why we believe the science-based targets was the right thing for us, well, it actually comes from our heritage. Basically, not a lot of people know, but Carlsberg is a company really based upon science and culture and arts. And something like the pH scale was in fact invented here in the Carlsberg laboratories. And if you don't take my word for it, you can just Google it, and I promise you that it is truthful. So basically, the pH scale is a result of trying to make better beer. This idea of science being in our blood also meant that, of course, when we set climate targets, they also need to be based on the best available science. And in our opinion, the SBTi is a tool to ensure that the ones who have actual real targets, the ones that do real reductions, that they can also have a methodology where they get that stamp. And we're very happy to see that the number since 2017 has grown to more than 1,000 companies having signed up to the SBTi. This is exactly the movement that we need from the private sector in order to stay on track towards the 1.5 degree scenario. Next slide. When you look at the process, it was a very long process, and Miles was part of that back in 2016. And I don't think that the process is really done justice in this one slide. But I can tell you that back in 2016, we engaged more than 50 internal stakeholders, everyone from finance to procurement to corporate affairs to marketing, to really make sure that we collected the right data and that we really got the right level of buy-in from across the business to do our Scope 3 accounting. We also started reaching out to our suppliers directly, so obtaining some of that primary data that Sam referred to. So basically not only relying on economic input-output models or secondary data, we really wanted to get as granular data from the beginning as was possible. And that engagement together with Carbon Trust resulted in us being able to have around 40% of our spend covered in that Scope 3 assessment. Of course, that means that the rest was coming from secondary data, but for us, it was a very, very good place to start because we basically focused on the biggest chunks of our value chain emissions through the initial hotspot analysis that we did with Carbon Trust, and therefore we could actually cover quite a lot of our actual emissions by focusing on specific categories. And obviously, when we look at our total value chain emissions, our breweries are also part of that. So we also did very, very specific analysis and data collection for all of our breweries in order to have the right baseline. Next slide. We decided to not do that exercise every year. So therefore, the next time we did this exercise was actually based on 2019 data. So we made a choice to say, instead of doing a not so granular analysis every year, we decided in the beginning to say we do it every 3 years because actually there won't be very big movements year on year within our full value chain carbon footprint. So therefore, the analysis we did in 2016 would still give us the direction on which actions we should take in order to reduce our total value chain emissions. So therefore, we decided to only do it every 3 years to begin with, but instead do it really thoroughly. So what you can then see here is that 3 years later, we involved a lot more internal people. We had more than double the amount of direct suppliers involved. We increased the amount of primary spend data with 20%. And of course, we continued to analyze the breweries within our scope. And what we also got from this update in reach in our supply chain and the level of detail we went into was also more granular data. Next slide, please. And this granular data really helped us to understand where are our emissions coming from, in which step in the value chain. Is it upstream, is it downstream, where is it significant, and where is it? And by the way, it also enabled us to, of course, track within each of the buckets of our value chain footprint in order to see where are we doing well and where are we not doing so well. And as you can see, we saw solid performance across our value chain categories, except within agriculture and processing. And basically, there are very, very good reasons for why that went slightly up. And one of the reasons is that we're in fact growing quite rapidly in the Asian region. And in the Asian region, we do not only use malting barley to make our beer, we also use some rice. And rice has higher carbon emissions in average than malting barley does. And that actually accounted for quite a big part of the increase in our agriculture and processing step. And the analysis that I just told you is actually an incredible good example of the result of the work with Carbon Trust on our value chain footprinting. Because basically, before we do that analysis on that level of detail, we will not have the understanding of which products will have which carbon footprint, which action in our business will result in an increase in emissions, and which parts will result in a decrease. Some of the things is common knowledge, like green electricity is good, decarbonized thermal energy. But the world is not that easy when you look at a global supply chain. And that is why we have the focus on primary data collection, engaging with our suppliers, also because that ultimately, without having the suppliers on board, we will not be able to reach the end goal, which is beer that doesn't emit any carbon emissions. When you look at the initial results from 15 to 19, we saw a solid 7% reduction in our total Scope 3 emissions. And for those of you who are not quite familiar with the kind of immensity of that, I have the next slide. So basically, when you look at what does that in effect mean? Well, it means that a 7% reduction means that we have taken around 200,000 average European cars off the road, or the equivalent of their emissions for a full year. And here I'm using an average internal combustion engine car. I'm happy to answer anything on the methodology, but we try to say this in order to give an idea of the scope of the reduction that we have already done, but also to make it clear that once we reach our 2022 target of 15% reduction, it will be 400,000 cars off the road, and in 2030, it will be the equivalent of 800,000 cars off the road, of course, on the road towards not having any emissions at all from our value chain. Next slide. So one of the things that I'd like to stress is that the benefit of having a detailed, granular process with strong methodology behind it means that you can actually go out and have conversations with local management teams across the world with a very, very good level of understanding of their business, of their reality. And this is where I think our partnership with Carbon Trust has really meant the most, that we were able to take the work that we did together and draw out the very, very detailed information and have conversations with the 35 management teams of the different companies that's comprising the Carlsberg Group, and make them understand exactly what is the impact of each of your value chain steps. How does your agriculture and processing emissions stack up? Where does it come from? And the answer to that is then, now you know and understand your emissions, so now you can reduce it. And that is the cause and effect relationship that we really like as the Carlsberg Group. We're a company that's really based on science. We have a lot of very, very, very skilled engineers and marketeers in our business. They want to understand their emissions so that they can reduce it. But it all starts with understanding. Next slide, please. So when you then look at, doing all the work and what Carbon Trust showed you, methodology and how it's complex, but I also just wanted to show you some of the very nice outcomes of actually being able to manage and measure and reduce your carbon emissions. So in Switzerland, for example, we're running the country's biggest electric truck fleet. So with 20 of the 26-ton trucks that can actually hold a very nice amount of beer. So that is delivering to our customers today. And this comes out of the fact that, of course, our Swiss business understood that a significant share of their emissions came from the logistics step. So how do they decarbonize it? Well, electric trucks and our partnership with Renault was a very, very good way of doing that. And obviously only running on 100% renewable electricity. Next, please. Another example can be found in Greece, where we could not find a very solid, stable source of thermal energy for our brewery. So if we wanted to decarbonize it, we had to think a little bit outside of the proverbial box. One of the initiatives we've done here is a cooperation with the startup at Solicon that can basically create renewable thermal heat, not electricity, but thermal heat. So we can replace some of the natural gas that we use at the brewery. We're starting with a pilot, and we will later then look at scaling that to really create a thermal source of renewable energy rather than only the green electricity that's available through solar panels and windmills, etc. Next slide, please. Another example is in the Utenios brewery, or Citrus Utenios brewery in Lithuania, where we're actually communicating directly on the pack that this beer is produced with 100% renewable energy. So this is one of the breweries where we have decarbonized both the thermal energy source and the electricity, so that we're able to tell the consumers, when you drink this beer, it's actually a beer that is produced with 100% energy, not only electricity. So of course, taking advantage of this towards the consumers and making them feel good about the product that they're buying is, of course, a very big part of what we also want to do, because we are a brand-led business. So we really also want to engage our consumers on this topic. Next, please. When you look at some of the other effects of being able to measure our carbon footprint, well, here's an example from Malaysia, where we have introduced a coating for the refillable bottles that we have. And basically what we saw was that for Malaysia, a refillable bottle was a very low carbon solution for that market. And also it was part of not generating waste in that particular market. So making sure that the bottles that we send into the market get back, wash it, send it back into the market, were really looking good, that they were not scratched, that the consumers felt that it was a nice experience to drink from that bottle, was a very, very good solution to keep the circular and low carbon economy alive for Malaysia. So that is why we introduced this coating, and really maintaining the life of these bottles in a way where the consumers don't feel they're getting an inferior scratched product at the same time. This helps us keep the carbon low, and it helps us keep our costs low as well. Next slide, please. And just to let you know where we then are on our journey towards zero carbon emissions at our breweries. Well, to date we have 8 breweries that's running on 100% renewable energy, and that is of course a journey that we will accelerate over the coming years. And you could say the overall understanding from our business, from our colleagues, from the group as a whole, really drives the actions that we need to reach our targets. We're not just talking the talk, we are walking the talk. And for those interested, well, in terms of our brewery target, where we set 50% reduction by 2022, year to date 2020, we were already down 39%. So we are really on track towards our short-term targets, not only in the value chain, where we had 7% from 15 to 19, but also at the breweries, where it was down 39%. So we're not just talking, we are definitely also walking the talk. Next slide, please. And that is of course nice to get recognition for. And I saw that Sam was highlighting the TCFD and the CDP projects as 2 of the, you say, quite high level investor interest and external environment interest when it comes to climate change and to our actions. So we're very happy to receive the A list for the CDP, which I'm sure is also due to all of the work that we've been doing on quantifying, measuring, and reducing our carbon emissions since 2016. And we also last year published our first TCFD aligned report in order to make it clear to our investors what we see as the main risks within the climate change and within carbon reduction. Next slide. So I think those were exactly my 20 minutes. So I will just encourage you, if you want to know more, you can always go to our website, carlsberggroup.com. You can go follow us on our social media channels at LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram. You will always get the newest and best information if you go and follow us directly. So please do so. Thank you very much.
That's terrific, Simon. Thank you very much, and thank you for keeping to time. And throwing bottles of beer up certainly woken up our audience. They've started to fire some questions, which is no surprise there. But I think what's really interesting coming from Simon's presentation there is, I mean, beer manufacturing, beer brewing is an energy-intensive process. And as Simon has highlighted there with examples in Lithuania and Finland and other places, they need to decarbonize not just power, electricity, but also heat sources. And they had the solar example from Greece, I think. These are real challenges that many companies face, but with innovation, Carlsberg is really demonstrating some really nice examples of a range of different technologies to overcome that. But let's not forget that even though Simon's breweries around the world are energy intensive, they need a lot of energy to brew beer. I think his slide showed with the value chain that it actually represents only a relative small proportion, maybe about 1/7 of the footprint of the beer in hand has footprint. So there's big impacts from the packaging, from the agriculture upstream and downstream in distribution and refrigeration. So I think it's a really nice way of, there we are, breweries now only 13%. So that energy intensive process, because they're decarbonizing it and improving efficiency, is shrinking in terms of size. But it's really important for a company like Carlsberg to be focusing on the bits that sit outside of their own processes. In particular, packaging is a big part, and that coating in Malaysia is a really good way of expanding the lifetime of those refillable bottles in the marketplace to reduce the individual use footprint. Okay, so let me have a look at some of the questions coming. We've got a couple of beer questions a bit later, but one of the first questions we had coming in from Richard Parler. Thank you for your conversation. We seem to be having enough extra extreme weather events at 1.5. This seems to point towards a need to go even further, and how is Carbon Trust addressing that? So a few things here. First of all, yes, we are now seeing extreme weather events. I think many stakeholders are really recognizing the impacts that the changes and the impacts that we are seeing. And if you look at some of the data from the insurance industry, they've got real live monitoring of the impacts, financial impacts and damage caused by extreme weather. So there's no doubts that what we're seeing in nature is demonstrating what the scientists have been telling us. When we talk about 1.5, what we're talking about is a trajectory that tries to limit the temperature change to a maximum of 1.5, which is a real challenge, but is certainly where we need to be aiming for to minimize the changes. But those changes are already, some of those changes are already locked in. We're seeing companies like Carlsberg setting ambitious targets on a steep trajectory that aligns to that 1.5. We've seen out of COP analysis showing that even though we've got stepping up of ambition, perhaps only limiting temperature to 2.4 from this last week's commitment, so still further to go. But we're also seeing Science-Based Target Initiative ramping up the hurdle and the requirements of companies like Carlsberg and many others of what targets they need to be setting. So requirements to be setting 1.5, certainly for scope 1, 2, and well below 2 degrees for scope 3. That's going to come in next July. So companies need to be ramping up their ambition. What we must always remember is two things. One, we need to get to net zero position by mid-century. That is what 1.5 aligns to. So the most important thing is to be reducing emissions. We see a lot of companies using offsetting. We see a lot of people talking about offsetting and carbon removal solutions, which will be important to address some of those hard to decarbonize areas. But the massive opportunity is in improving efficiency and then using cleaner energy sources to bring down emissions. And the other thing, of course, to remember is that climate change is driven from a cumulative building up of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So it isn't just hitting a target in 2030 or 2050. It's actually important to minimize the cumulative emissions that we put out there, and we have a overall cumulative budget emissions that we need to try and keep below. So the quicker we can bring down some of these curves, the quicker we can implement reduction opportunities, the more we're going to help ourselves to minimize that temperature change. Hopefully that helps a little bit in terms of some of the narrative and some of the thinking around those numbers, but certainly we are seeing quite a shift in ambition, and I think from examples like Carlsberg, but many others, a shift in actual action, and that is probably the most important thing for the next few years, is actually to see action in the right direction. Example of the electrification of delivery vehicles was a really good example. We are seeing the movement towards electric vehicles across fleets, but looking at the real life emissions of those vehicles and how that can be achieved as quickly as possible is really important. Okay, hopefully that helps add a little bit of flavor, Richard. We also had a question from Richard as well on can I cover slightly on TCF? He said TNFD. I think you mean TCFD. So just Sam mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. So this is a framework that has been developed and is evolving over time, requiring companies to disclose to their investors what they are doing in terms of evaluating both the risks and the opportunities to corporate value from climate-related impacts, and needing to look at a number of different scenarios and look at how the business may be impacted against those credible scenarios. So it's a process, really, a disclosure process, which demonstrates that the board and senior management of a business are properly evaluating what the impacts may be. And we must remember, it's not always risks, it is also opportunity. And for a lot of companies, there's big growth opportunities in the changing sectors because of climate change. They can actually help to deliver technology or deliver new business models, different products and solutions that can address some of the areas of major emissions. So there is opportunity, there is added value that can be tapped, but also there are risks which may come from technology, maybe new competitors, maybe changing customers, whether they be consumers or corporate customers, or the physical impacts of climate change and the disruption that could cause to perhaps a supply chain. So it's really stepping up the requirement for boards and senior management to be doing what they should be doing, recognizing the impacts and the changes, and documenting and demonstrating that they are evaluating and then taking action against those. Hopefully that answers that question. Just quickly scanning down, we've got a couple of questions on beer now, from Samantha, I think, and also maybe there was somebody else, but so Samantha's got a question. She's looking for a German brewery which will like to establish in China to brew made in Germany beer. But I suspect that Simon may have some better solutions in terms of offering Chinese brewed beer from Carlsberg, perhaps, that maybe be able to deliver a more sustainable solution in the market.
Well,
Any
I'm not
thoughts from
quite sure
China,
that,
Simon?
I'm not quite sure this was a question. It was more of a call to action from Samantha, I guess. But I do have a question from Richard, which is asking whether some of our beers are more sustainable than others, I believe. So basically, the answer is yes, because obviously the Scope 3 emissions showed us that the carbon impact of every single brewery around the world changes according to the raw materials we use, to the carbon intensity of all of those raw materials, but also to the production process. But if I'm being a little bit more generalistic, then if you want to do the best you can for the environment, then you have a pint at the pub, because basically draft beer has the lowest carbon footprint in a single serve that you can find, and that is universal. The next best, so to speak, if you want to look at it from a carbon perspective, is a refillable glass bottle. So in some markets, then we have these systems where the bottles, they come back, and as long as it's within a certain distance from our brewery, so that it's not traveling too much in the reverse logistics bit, then a refillable glass bottle has the second lowest carbon footprint. And the following packaging types that we have is then a can, which is number 3, alongside a PET bottle. And the one with the highest carbon footprint is actually a glass bottle that is only used once. So where you drink it, it's sent for recycling, it's smashed, made into cullet, put back into a glass bottle and comes back. Well, that one has the highest carbon footprint, but obviously all of our packaging has other benefits, and the consumers, they want to have the choice. So therefore, our aim is really to reduce the carbon impact of all of our products, regardless of what they're served in, rather than looking at choice editing, so to speak.
Great, thank you for that. I have just had flagged up to me that TNFD was not a typo. Task Force for Nature-Based Financial Disclosure. Now, this is something which I wasn't aware of, but I would definitely reference people to go and have a read of. But I think what it does demonstrate actually is it does align to actually what we're seeing, which is the importance of understanding in your value chain impacts beyond maybe carbon, although obviously impacts on nature can have quite a negative impact on carbon emissions. We're seeing that in forestry and other areas. But there is clearly a broadening view and need to evaluate impacts across whole value chains, and that is driven from this type of work, and the need for companies to be able to develop strategies to minimize those impacts, which may go beyond greenhouse gas emissions to other impacts, perhaps on biodiversity, water, local air pollution, and other impacts. So this is something which is important as part of a strategy to make sure that you're not doing any harm elsewhere by trying to drive forwards specifically on greenhouse gas emissions and carbon emissions. Probably a good example is, again, going back to vehicles and the challenges being put to the car industry as they move to electrification and battery electric vehicles, understanding the sourcing of the raw materials, the recyclability of those batteries and the materials, recovering those materials to reuse. So there's a lot of, it's really important to be understanding that and then to minimize those impacts beyond greenhouse gases. Just quickly jumping into the Q&A. So I've got a couple more coming through. When replacing diesel or petrol or gas trucks with EV, are you considering the full end-to-end CO2 emissions?
I'll be happy to answer that one, Miles. So basically,
Yep.
I think it is of course an area that's discussed a lot among companies and governments, and I think it's pretty clear that everybody accepts that electric vehicles are behind on points when they are born. Okay, so the scale of how much behind on points, that is something that has a very big scientific discussion behind it, and I won't go into the details there, but I think it's safe to say that the kind of most independent scientists that I have seen, they say that, for example, a normal car will be catching up, an electric car will catch up with a diesel or gas equivalent once it has driven anything from between 30 to 50,000 kilometers. So it is behind on points indeed when it is born, but given the fact that it can run on 100% renewable energy, it has a lot of benefits in the full total life cycle of that use. So whether it is 35, 40 or 50 or even 60 in a country with a dirty grid, I won't go into the details on that. What is important for us is that whenever we use electric vehicles, we are aware that they're behind on points from the beginning, and that's why we want them to run on 100% renewable energy, because then they will catch up quite fast to a ICE, internal combustion engine equivalent.
Yeah, thank you, Simon. I mean, I would just add, I mean, we're working quite a lot with the upstream industry supporting the transition for electric vehicles. There's a lot of work going on to measure and understand the embedded emissions in vehicles, whether they be ICE or battery electric vehicles. There's a lot of work going on looking at the different chemistries and also the sourcing of raw materials and of the recyclability of those materials as well. I think the important thing, first of all, to realize is if we want to decarbonize transport, we can achieve that with electric vehicles, but we can't achieve that with internal combustion engines using fossil fuels. As Simon has mentioned, there's a range of analysis looking at different footprints, and the embedded footprint, as we call it, the impact of the manufacturing is as important as the in-use phase, and becoming more and more important as vehicles become cleaner in use. And I would just say that is something that is being worked on, and is a journey that will continue quite significantly. There's also the other aspect, which is the amount of use a vehicle gets, and a lot of vehicles, most of our cars on the roads today, sit doing very little for most of their life. So new business models perhaps open up opportunity to share vehicles and get more use out of the vehicle, as well as obviously address the end of life use. But it's a bit like Simon's beer bottle. If we can get 25 uses out of a glass bottle by reusing it, refilling it, that's got to be better than creating a new bottle, whether it's from virgin materials or from recycled glass, for every use. So yeah, interesting area. Certainly a lot of work going on there, but in terms of how do we decarbonize transport, road vehicles is easier, and we do have technologies today that can deliver that for us. Other parts of transport industry perhaps are a bit more challenging, such as aviation. We're going to have to finish there because we're just on the dot of 1 o'clock in London, 2 o'clock in Copenhagen and Europe, and other times that you all are on. And just want to thank everyone for their time. Thank you, Simon, for sharing your experience with us, Carbon Trust, and thank you for our hosts, ICC, and others for making this interesting session. So wish everyone a happy day, and speak to you all soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.